So as I was, I'm assuming Brina is behind this little black box. Hello, Brina. Um, I'm happy to start on time. As I was explaining to our speakers tonight, Brina and Paulina, we have a lot of people who at the last minute told us they couldn't be here tonight, but who asked us to record it. So I'm letting you know if you are on the Zoom tonight that we are recording, and welcome on behalf of UJA-JCC Greenwich. Um, you know, Today of all days, I'm really glad that we're hosting this. I don't know if it's a training, but certainly program on this topic, because today is exactly the kind of day when 650 rockets rain down on Israel, that if kids were all on campus together, they'd be facing an enormous amount of rhetoric, both in person and on social media, that I'm not sure that they are prepared to handle. So I'm very happy tonight that we have, I'm admitting while I'm talking, Paulina Carey and Brina Chu. Brina is the Community Strategy Manager for the Israel Action Network, and Paulina Carey is the Senior Manager of National Strategy. Israel Action Network is part of Jewish Federations of North America. It's something we support at UJA-JCC with our allocable dollars. And I'm sure you guys will talk a little bit more about it. And I don't know which one I'm turning it over to, but it's your floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam, and appreciate you having us here virtually and the opportunity to speak to this group tonight. So thank you. So I'm going to share my screen, so give me a second here just to figure that out, and then we'll get started. Okay, second. Okay, awesome. Okay, so originally we were going to introduce ourselves, but I feel like you've already taken care of that, Pam, so thank you. As Pam said, Paulina and myself are part of Israel Action Network, which is a joint initiative of JFNA and JCPA. IAN's mission is to build support for Israel through the lens of a two-state solution, while also combating the delegitimization of Israel, including BDS. We'll go more into that in depth as our presentation goes on. So I'm just going to go ahead and get us started here. So this presentation is called Parents Guide to Campus. Should put an apostrophe in there. And so really the incentive for this presentation is, as parents, we understand, and grandparents, of course, your kids' college experience can be intimidating and can be scary. And as Jewish parents or Jewish family members, you understandably have unique concerns, considering the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric and activity. So a few things that we're going to address in this presentation are: what does Jewish life really look like on campus in 2021? What are some of the challenges that Jewish students may face? What are support systems on campus, including Jewish organizations, that may be helpful to your college-bound child and that they can turn to in times of need and even not in times of need? So those are a few things we'll go over. I'll also say that as a university alumni who went through college experiences as a Jewish student, I went to Binghamton University. It's a state university in upstate New York, part of the SUNY system. I really, really loved it. Best 4 years of my life. It has a very active Jewish presence and pro-Israel presence. Specifically, it's where I kind of found my Israel advocacy voice and became passionate about the issues. And so even though I had a very positive experience, there still were things that I wish that I knew when I was in your child or grandchild's shoes. And our goal tonight is really to impart information onto you and some tools and strategies and tips onto you that you can use to have proactive conversations with your college-bound teen or young adult. So As you can imagine, life on a college campus today, not that I would know because I'm not on it, but I imagine that it's changed significantly since Paulina and myself went to college, and since you went to college as well. So this is a snapshot on the slide of how things may have changed over the years. There's some trends that are helpful for you to keep in mind as we kind of move forward. So the first being that Jewish students are more diverse than ever before. And this reflects the growing trend in the American Jewish population and in the US in general, that the American Jewish population is becoming more diverse. A study that was done by the Jews of Color Initiative last year found that 20% of American Jewry identify as Jews of color. And so we can expect this trend only to grow as the years go on. Also, many Jewish students come from households with one Jewish parent. So a lot of them are coming from interfaith families with interfaith backgrounds. On the positive side, more opportunities exist than ever for Jewish students to connect and engage Jewishly, whatever that means to them. On the flip side of that, there have been an increase of anti-Semitic incidents that are taking place. And so all important to keep in mind. Another trend that we wanted to talk about that's not listed on this slide is that younger Jews, more so than their predecessors, tend to be drawn towards more grassroots and independent movements than organized Jewish life. So the trend here is that Jews nowadays are kind of moving away from the institutional way of life, like synagogues, Jew clubs, things like that, and more towards, okay, like let me kind of create my own Jewish experience and pave my own way. And not to say that that Jewish students nowadays don't like institutions or don't affiliate with them. It's just something to keep in mind. Also, another thing to note is that every campus is very different and has a very different makeup in terms of pro-Israel and Jewish student population. And this obviously is contributed to by political leanings on US politics. This can impact the nature of campus climate around Israel. And so the other thing is that there are many pro-Israel organizations and Jewish organizations that exist that we'll discuss a little later in the presentation. Many, you may have heard of, including Hillel Chabad, are the popular ones that everyone knows. And there are also organizations that serve as detractors to pro-Israel or Jewish activity, including groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, etc. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about who we're referring to when we're talking about Jewish students on campus. So the vast majority of them were born into what is called Generation Z. So Gen Zers, I'm just going to read a little bit off here, but they were born between 1996 and 2012, maybe a little bit later, depending on where you look, what source you're looking at. 48% of them non-white, 25% of them Hispanic. They tend to be very similar to millennials politically, and they struggle with major challenges with depression and anxiety. And something that's important to keep in mind is, understanding that they are different than the generations that come before them. Their politics on Israel are no exception. And so let's get on to the interesting stuff. How do Gen Zers feel about Israel and the conflict around Israel and Palestinians? So as you may have already anticipated, or as you may know, Gen Zers, along with millennials, who are the next to oldest generation, in which Paulina and myself are a part of, sympathize more with the Palestinians in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and have a less favorable view of the Israeli government than the generations that preceded them. So according to a study that was conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2016, which is not on the slide, but I'll get to the study that's on the slide in a second, 27% of millennials sympathize with the Palestinian cause, as opposed to 17% of Gen Xers, 14% of baby boomers, and 15% of the silent generation, which is the generation that came before the boomers. And as you can see from this current slide, which shows a different Pew study that was conducted more recently in 2019, we're seeing that Gen Z, who are part of the 18 to 29-year-old age bracket, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but that's what it is falling in line with this trend in terms of being more likely to sympathize with Palestinians, and in addition to that, less likely to have a favorable view of the Israeli government than the generations that came before them. So taking this in, this is a trend that you should definitely be aware of, but also noting that it's pretty normal, it's pretty expected for younger generations to have differing views than their parents. And another thing to think about is what is the reasoning behind these trends that we're seeing, right? So the silent generation, for example, who were born between 1928 and 1945, remember a time when the state of Israel did not exist. They remember the Holocaust. Many of them actually lived through the horrors of the Holocaust, or were surrounded by the aftermath at least. So it's understandable that they view Israel in a different light. Baby boomers remember the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, and they recall times when Israel was really on the brink of destruction. And then we start seeing the Gen Xers who came after the boomers and before a time when opportunities like Birthright and other Israel engagement programming existed. So for millennials, a large number of them, have been to Israel, but there's actually a divide that we're seeing in terms of the trends between the older millennials and the younger millennials, and that the older millennials recall the Camp David Accords and have seen Israel during a time of peace and relative calm. And the younger millennials who came of age post 9/11 have mostly seen Israel during times of war. So as you can see from the previous slide, though, when asked how they aligned with the statement, I feel a strong connection to Israel, the vast majority of Gen Zers, 71% of them, either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. So that's notable, and only 3% of them strongly disagreed with that statement, by the way. And this goes to show that though our younger generations are expressing more progressive views around the conflict, they are still feeling connected to Israel and overall still see Israel in a positive light. And this nuance is really notable and should be kept in mind as we continue to talk about who this generation really is, and how we can better understand them and their values, relate to their experiences, and have productive conversations with them. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about campus trends. So one trend that we're seeing is that SJP, we referred to it earlier as Students for Justice in Palestine, and its allies on campus, we call these the detractors, have really doubled down on a strategy of kind of co-opting broader progressive movements in order to get their message across. And they're really doing this through the lens of intersectionality. So intersectionality is a way of seeing struggles through multiple lenses. So for example, someone who is a Black woman faces racism and faces sexism, two different oppressions as part of the same whole discrimination. And on campus, intersectionality connects different types of oppression under one nexus. So the way that this shows up around Israel issues is that there's a trope that says, look, if you're against racism, if you're against gender discrimination, if you are against homophobia, et cetera, the list goes on, you are against Israel. Tropes, that you can't be both progressive and pro-Israel or Zionist, or that it's a conflict of interest, are really prominent in some groups on these campuses. Not to say that they're prominent in every progressive group that we see on every campus. Once again, let's not, generalize here. But when this happens, and we're seeing this trend happen more and more, it makes pro-Israel Jewish students feel like they have to give up a really important part of their identities to be accepted into this fold and to be identified as a quote unquote progressive person. So another example of this, of trends that we're seeing, is the kind of anti-Israel activist style. It's a type of delegitimization that we often see. The loud minority or the loud anti-Israel minority on campus disrupting pro-Israel events. Usually, this would happen in person. So it would happen at a large Yom HaAtzmaut celebration or in a big auditorium where an Israeli speaker comes to talk to the students. And it looks like a lot of people coming in with signs and, clapping and stamping their feet and making a lot of noise. And then another way that we're seeing this is the targeting of Jews or Israelis who aren't talking directly about the conflict or even associated with the conflict in a way that attributes them to actions that are taken by the Israeli government or the Israeli military, and really paints them in a negative light that centers the conflict and ignores the humanity behind the situation, and ignores really all other aspects of Israeli and Jewish identity aside from how it relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So these are just a few examples, but due to COVID, really, we've been seeing, this change and evolve many of these trends have migrated online in the form of anti-Semitic and or anti-Israel Zoom bombing, cyberbullying. Sometimes this can look like really nasty comments or posts that are aimed at pro-Israel or Jewish students. Pages that are set up to, oppose or demonize Israel or specifically pro-Israel clubs, things like that. Okay, so what do we mean? I'm gonna make sure this, yep, great. So what do we mean when we say the delegitimization of Israel? We've thrown out that term a few times. So the definition we have in this slide is that delegitimization is a global campaign to demonize and isolate Israel in order to undermine the sovereignty of the democratic Jewish state of Israel and the two-state solution. That's kind of a mouthful, but we're gonna process it together. So delegitimization is not necessarily equivalent to BDS. And we know that those things often go together in your mind. So BDS, which we'll go into a little bit later, is a tactic of delegitimization, but there are also other forms of it. And we really define delegitimization as actions and language that demonize Israel, seek to deny or erase its Jewish character, and really undermine the prospect of a potential two-state solution that benefits both parties. So for example, something that would be delegitimization but wouldn't be considered divestment or BDS would be a UN resolution or piece of legislation that unfairly targets Israel and aims to remove the Jewish character of the state of Israel, and also paints all Jewish folks as colonial invaders, right? So that would be one example. There are others, but we're gonna move on from this from now. We're just giving you the broad strokes of everything. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so right now we're going to show you a video of the students at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So this is a campus that has especially faced years of perpetual anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity, specifically efforts within the student government to separate anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism as two different entities. And in order to respond to these efforts, students that were pro-Israel activists really came together and mobilized as a community to show their support for Israel and to show that their support for Israel and their Jewish identity were intertwined and one could not be understood without the other. So it's a really powerful video. What I'm gonna have to do is I'm gonna have to stop sharing it and I'm gonna have to share a different screen. Bear with me here. And okay. Paulina, can you confirm you're seeing? Okay. Start from the beginning.
Survivor. It's a shame that we should be here right now discussing this. But I'm proud to be here in
A little hard to hear.
guys, united as a Jewish family. I would like to share a quote that my grandmother just told me this past Yom Kippur, as she shares with me stories from her experience in the Holocaust. She said it was the last months of the Holocaust on Yom Kippur, and this was her prayer. Why couldn't I have been born a dog rather than a Jewish girl? A stray dog people will show mercy to. Let it live. Even feed it and take care of it. While the fate of a lost Jewish girl, if caught, was worse than death. And I vow, and I want every one of you guys to vow, that none of us shall
as we reach the ending of this, I'd like to thank the Jewish organizations that all had a tremendous part in what happened. I'd like to thank Hillel, Chabad, Jet, Sinai Temple, the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation, and most importantly, all of you, the Jewish students. Thank you. Woo! Woo! Am Yisrael Chai! Am Yisrael Chai! Am Yisrael! Am Yisrael! Am Yisrael Chai! Am Yisrael Chai! Am Yisrael Chai! Am Yisrael! Am Yisrael! Am Yisrael Chai! Am Yisrael! Am Yisrael! Am Yisrael Chai!
I'm still on my.
Yeah, that's not my thing.
You're right, Jerry, to get in there.
Hi, I'm back. So really we wanted to show you that video to show you kind of what resilience looks like in the face of all of the, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic activity that was going on campus. The Jewish students really came together with the support of Jewish organizations. It didn't, hurt that Federation got a shout out in that video, to overcome and to continue, being proud of their Jewish identities, being proud of their Zionist identities in spite of everything that was going on. And hopefully this gives you some comfort to know that, even if your child or your family member does end up on a campus where there are similar challenges, that, there is a strong infrastructure, and that infrastructure is really the community. So I'm going to go back to sharing my other screen. So many screens. Okay. Second. Okay. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about delegitimization in general, let's talk more specifically about BDS. So as we said, one prominent form of delegitimization is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, otherwise known as BDS. So BDS can show up in a variety of different ways on campus, if it shows up at all. And there are varying degrees of BDS advocacy, as it is a spectrum. So one way that we've seen BDS show up is through calls to boycott Israeli products on campus. So one classic BDS move is the effort to boycott Sabra hummus in local campus stores. Usually what ends up happening is the students protest, they make a petition to remove the hummus from the store. It's removed from the store, and then lo and behold, a few days later, it usually ends up being put back in the store. And sometimes they put in like tribe hummus or a different brand to replace it. But this really kind of defeats the point of their protest, right? So one other thing that's not well known about Sabra is that it's co-owned by Pepsi, which, as we know, is an American company whose headquarters are in New York. And the important thing that we really want to get across about these types of campaigns is that their impact lies mostly on influencing people's hearts and minds around the conflict, but not really so much on the actual economic outcome of the boycott. And this is similar to divestment campaigns that we've seen in that they really call on universities. So this is a different type of campaign than a boycott, but they call on universities to divest their investment portfolios from Israeli companies by calling for this action through student government sanction resolutions. So this is a student-led campaign to get resolutions passed in student government votes. And many of these resolutions have passed on campuses, but administrators really often lack a motive or interest in actually seeing those actions through. So the main takeaway here is that even though BDS doesn't have a major economic impact on Israel, as we can see from these two forms of BDS advocacy on campus, it can still sour the campus climate and make it a fearful environment for pro-Israel students where they don't feel safe, and ultimately it is hurtful in a psychological capacity, if not an economic one. So we know that BDS is problematic for many reasons. And a prominent one being that it is integrated with anti-Semitic tropes throughout the movement and throughout the leadership that makes up BDS. So our question and your question might be, why would any well-meaning student actually choose to support BDS? So one of the possible reasons is going back to the intersectionality trope that we talked about earlier. BDS really advertises itself as a progressive cause that seeks to restore justice and human rights to the Palestinian people. So the message is, if you believe in reproductive justice, if you believe in immigrant rights, refugee rights, if you believe in advocating for people of color, you should believe in BDS, as it labels itself as an advocacy organization that fights for the Palestinian cause. BDS really employs black and white thinking, such as, do you support human rights and justice? Then you support BDS. Do you stand against colonialism and murder? Well, then you support BDS. And BDS targets well-meaning individuals who really don't have much of an extensive knowledge of the conflict, which I know it's, in all of our minds every day, but most people don't have this extensive knowledge. They barely know what the acronym stands for. But these people really want to do something to help further what they see as a good and meaningful cause, even though they don't know the context or really much about it. And this makes them an easy target. So let's talk about some of the ways that BDS may show up on your college-bound young adults campus. So one of the tactics that's commonly used by BDS activists is the mock apartheid wall. So this in person, as you can see in this picture, is really an attention-grabbing campaign. Students build, a mock physical wall, usually in the center of campus or somewhere that gets a lot of foot traffic. And it's really meant to mimic the security barrier that separates Israel from the Palestinian territories. And is really, intended to create a lot of noise, a lot of big spectacles, just drawing attention to unknowing students on campus who know almost nothing about the issues. And like many BDS arguments, it really presents the situations in Israel and the Palestinian territories in a very black and white way, and ignores the very real, for example, with the wall, it ignores the very real security concerns that Israel has. What are the acts of terrorism that have led to the security concerns? None of this is addressed through this apartheid wall. Often the apartheid wall can be expected to go up during what is known as Israel Apartheid Week on campus, where there are often a lot of other anti-Israel activities that are happening, disruptions of pro-Israel events. This often happens in February or March. So one other way that BDS has evolved during the pandemic is that many campaigns, as you can imagine, knowing your Gen Z child or young adult, happen online. And what used to be advertised through flyers on campus, for example, anti-Israel groups mobilizing students around getting the student government to pass a BDS resolution. Normally that would happen physically at a student government meeting. It would happen through coalition building where groups form relationships with each other through, going to each other's events, seeing each other in person, and now it's all happening online. And these campaigns really happen on platforms like Instagram and Twitter, through pages that are dedicated to divestment, dedicated to other progressive causes and include BDS. And usually it looks like, colorful informational infographics or posts, online petitions, educational webinars and meetings. There's not much to work with, but the BDS activists have migrated, completely online and have adjusted to this new form of activism. And this really puts pro-Israel students at a disadvantage because many times they don't actually know that an anti-Israel campaign has, taken off on their campus, whereas they might know, in the before days, if they saw that meetings were happening and, clubs were mobilizing, they see it physically in front of them, they can't see all that behind the scenes organizing. So often they don't find out about it until it has already amassed support through social media, until the coalition building process has already happened, and other groups are supporting BDS. And this really puts groups like Hillel, who are supporting these students, on the defensive, and really requires pro-Israel students to strengthen their social presence and their social media game to combat these campaigns. So we wanted to share with you this quote, so I'm just going to read it. Classical anti-Semitism denies the rights of Jews as citizens within society. Anti-Zionism denies the equal rights of the Jewish people to its lawful sovereignty within the community of nations. All that has happened here is that The discriminatory principle has been transferred from the realm of individual rights to the domain of collective identity. So this quote comes from Abba Eban, who served as former foreign minister and ambassador to the United States and the UN between 1966 and 1974. And it really clearly illustrates the way that anti-Zionism can merge with anti-Semitism and intersect with it. And especially how left-leaning organizations, although they claim to be against anti-Semitism, if they espouse anti-Zionist rhetoric, that demonizes the Jewish state, it's still rooted in anti-Semitism. It's just showing up differently than classical anti-Semitism would. So rather than the discrimination against people's individual rights, it shows up as ethnic discrimination of an ethnic group, the Jewish people. So again, instead of that person, quote, that person is responsible for the blood libel, which is more, a classical anti-Semitism trope we're used to hearing, it sounds like, quote, all Jews are fascists, or quote, all Jews are Nazis. So on that lovely note, I'm going to turn it over to my lovely colleague, Paulina.
Thanks, Brina. Just to piggyback off this timeless quote, here are some examples we've seen of when anti-Zionism really veers into anti-Semitism. It's important to note that this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the main examples used by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition on anti-Semitism. Of course, one can definitely be critical of aspects of Israel policy, Israeli government, without being anti-Semitic, but these are some clear-cut examples of when a line has definitely been crossed and something to be aware of when anti-Israel events take place on your student's college campus. For example, using Holocaust and other anti-Semitic imagery to prove a point, calling Israelis the new Nazis, or drawing a Hitler mustache on Prime Minister Netanyahu, claiming that Jews are European colonial invaders of the land, that there is no historical connection that Jews have to Israel. Depicting Jews or Israelis dominating finance or the media, or claims that Jews control the United States government. These sort of things is when it becomes very clear that we're not talking about criticism of Israeli policy anymore. We're just using old anti-Semitic tropes in a new fashion. Next slide. Despite all the negatives we've gone over, there is plenty of infrastructure for pro-Israel activism and Jewish life on campus, including Hillel, Chabad, and other smaller or independent student groups that have plenty of leadership opportunities and activities to educate students about Israel in fun, exciting ways. Many groups on a variety of campuses work very hard to share Israeli culture, like music, food, and cinema, with the campus at large. Some of these groups also provide opportunities for discussion to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, along with other Jewish issues like identity and other such things in nuanced and open ways. So it's really, I know that we've been a little negative during this presentation, but it's important to keep in mind that there is, on most campuses, a very vibrant Jewish community and many, many groups that are looking to engage with your students in a positive Jewish way. Next slide. IEN, in partnership with the network of federations and JCRCs, are unique in that we view the campus as an ecosystem made up of different moving parts, each of which has a role to play when it comes to providing resources to Jewish students, supporting Jewish life on campus, and standing up to anti-Semitism and BDS. Your college student should ideally be on campus for around 4 years, but there are plenty of other stakeholders that will be on or around this college campus for a lifetime. And so they have a really deep impact on college policy. IN is connected to all of the federations and network federations, and we're here to act as a resource. And one way that we act as a resource is to reach out to influential and important members of the campus ecosystem. And I'm going to just dive into a few of them, but here's a list for you as well, just to look at. This is really how we view campus, is that it's the students, it's the professors, it's the board of trustees, it's the administrators, it's the pro-Jewish life groups, it's just the community in general. Next slide, please. So one aspect of the campus ecosystem I want to focus on are professors. In some cases, professors have been on the forefront of leading BDS on college campuses or otherwise marginalizing the experience of Jewish and pro-Israel students. One main example was in 2018, when an instructor at the University of Michigan declined to write a recommendation letter for a student to study in Israel due to his support for the boycott of Israeli universities. There have also been many cases of academic associations like the Modern Language Association, which is an organization of more than 24,000 scholars of language and literature, attempting to pass anti-Israel resolutions and or support boycotts of Israeli academic institutions. However, it is important to keep in mind that most professors, no matter what their personal opinion is on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they overall support academic freedom and the right to hold different and difficult ideas, particularly on college campuses. I mean, that's the reason students go to campus, to have their ideas challenged in a safe environment. Many professors have used academic associations like the Modern Language Association to pass resolutions in support of academic freedom and denounce any sort of boycott of any academic institution, no matter where they are located. So it really is an individual case-by-case basis. One more thing, Brina. So IN has worked with its academic allies in this space to create israelintheacademy.org, which is a website that aims to educate, inform, and empower those who believe in the existence and legitimacy of a secure and democratic homeland for the Jewish people. To that end, it provides an in-depth look at how BDS is played out on numerous college campuses, as well as more than 300 model curricula that pro-Israel and Jewish professors use to teach about Jewish identity in a positive and fair way. So if you have any more follow-up questions, we're more than happy to answer, but I can also point to this website as a resource if you want to see how BDS is played out at different universities, or you want to see how a certain professor teaches about Israeli history. It has both of those materials available. Okay, next slide, Brina. Thank you. Campus climate is important, obviously, when selecting which college to go to. What is Jewish life like there? Are Jewish voices included when it comes to diversity and dialogue conversations? Administrators and university leadership are some of the most important actors when it comes to making sure anti-Semitism is not supported anywhere on college campuses, and to make sure Jewish students feel well represented and safe in student government, clubs, classes, basically everywhere. BDS resolutions are just one way that Jewish students can feel isolated and targeted at their own schools. IAN is also concerned about the overall environment for Jewish students before and after these sort of BDS resolution votes take place. To that end, we work very closely with federations, Hillel's, the Israel on Campus Coalition, and other pro-Israel and Jewish groups to ensure that administrations adopt policies denouncing anti-Semitism and follow up these declarations with measurable actions, such as trainings, growing awareness around anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, what these sort of activities mean for Jewish students, all of these sort of things that can help make colleges institutionally safer for Jewish students. Next slide, please. So as this chart illustrates, we work in a broad coalition of pro-Israel and Jewish organizations. We sit in on weekly calls convened by the Israel Campus Coalition, and we really work to address the local needs of Jewish students on campus through the federation system, as they know the campus ecosystem best. I'm now going to turn it over to Brina to outline some questions you can ask your teenager.
So thank you so much, Paulina. So we want to take all of that information that we just kind of threw at you and say, okay, so how do we actually use this to talk to our young adults about these issues and about Israel activism? So first thing we want to keep in mind is that realistically, Israel advocacy and Israel activism isn't a job that necessarily everyone wants, right? So for some, it'll take them a while to get there, and for others, really will, and it won't really be their passion. It's not how they're going to relate Jewishly. Either way, how can you have a conversation with your child or grandchild about Israel so that they know that you're actually listening? So we've put up some questions here that you could think about when you are practicing your active listening in these conversations. And we're going to talk a little bit about some tips and strategies for talking to your Gen Zer or other younger generations about Israel. So the first thing that we want to bring up is, what messaging does this age group really respond to? Why? And how can parents or grandparents meet their teens and other younger age groups where they're at? So one of the ways that we're going to offer up to you is asking for concrete information, right? So if our goal is to understand where the other person, in this case, your child's conclusions are coming from about the conflict, about the issues, and enrich your understanding of what they envision going forward, it helps you to ask them to be really explicit about their reasoning and their vision behind their values. So for example, some of these questions are, what leads you to say that? Can you give me an example? Can you say a little more? These are all asking them for more information. So if they were to say something like, Israel is bad, or, I heard on the news, or a friend told me that, that Israel treats Palestinians terribly, whatever it is, you know more, why is it that they believe what they believe, and where did that come from? And what is the surrounding information you need to understand how they got from point A to point B? So when we argue, we as humans, we're kind of socialized to trade conclusions, or in other words, try to win arguments, right? So we usually have like a point counterpoint debate style when we're talking about issues that are, tense for us, that we know that we disagree on, rather than actually explore how those conclusions make sense within their narrative and find the why behind the argument. And so questions like these can be really helpful tools to guide us through the why of our perspectives and beliefs, and also really give your child or your young adult the space not to know the answer to questions right away, right? And so when you ask them these questions and they say, oh, I don't know, what impact your actions have had on me. I don't know why this is important to me. I don't know why I care. And to really validate that and say, like, that's okay. Like, take the time to think about it, and like, we can explore that together. It kind of helps make them more comfortable and puts them in a less confrontational space, so that they trust you and want to continue having the conversation with you. And it also really shows that you care about them. And honestly, increases the chance that they'll actually respond to you, and respond to you openly and honestly, rather than closing themselves off to you. So in particular, these questions have a theme, as you can see, where we're really asking, how do you see the situation differently than I do? Where a common tendency is to try to find points of agreement. Another thing we're socialized to do, because it's reassuring. Asking the other person how they see things differently is actually more helpful. Because if you're asking for agreement, people may be reluctant to actually share their doubts with you and their reservations. They aren't sure whether you really want to hear what they're saying, whether you really even care what they're saying, or you just want to come to a point of agreement or consensus, and they feel this kind of like pressure to be on the same page as you. But if you're asking them explicitly how they see it differently, you're more likely to end up discovering what their true reaction is. And then that is where the real conversation can begin. And obviously these questions, are meant to be helpful to you as examples of non-confrontational questions to help get you started, but it's really up to you to continue the conversation and take it from there. So we're going to do a very short exercise. It's not really even an exercise, but kind of a role play situation. Actually, can I have one of you read the scenario? Be helpful.
People can unmute, they can unmute themselves if they want.
Feel free, we're all friends here.
No takers.
Either of the Jills? You're the people I see on my screen, so.
Sure, I'll read.
Thanks.
You and your child are walking to the grocery store, and on the way you pass a protest where your city's local SJP chapter is holding a protest to boycott Israeli products. They shout 2468, Israel is racist state. Boycott Israel. Your child asks you, how can our Jewish community support Israel when it clearly treats Palestinians so poorly?
Right. Thank you so much, Jill. Very dramatic reading. I loved it. So take a minute or so to just read this over and think about, based on what we just talked about, based on remembering all these things that are on their slide here, what are some potential responses that you could give to your child? What, are some responses that you could give, more importantly, that would lead to an open dialogue rather than to a debate? And feel free to either unmute yourself or put your suggestions in the chat.
You could
Yes.
ask, well, can you give me some examples of how Israel is treating the Palestinians poorly?
Right. That's awesome. Yes. Asking for more information, asking, okay, so where did this come from? Right? Like, what is behind this? Rather than just like reacting to the question itself, you're trying to figure out what is behind the question, which is going to give you the information you ultimately need to be part of that conversation, rather than just, having a debate.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off what Brina's saying, I know that these are emotional conversations and that we all have very strong opinions on this, but sometimes it is worthwhile to not ignore that, but take a step back and allow yourself to listen, which is hard when you feel emotional about a topic. And so it might take practice.
Yeah, I think a lot of the tools we're trying to provide you with really go against our basic human instinct. We don't want to listen. We want to talk. We want to shout. We want to like shout from the rooftops what our opinions are. As Polina said, it's a very charged issue, so it's really hard to control ourselves. But I promise that the outcome of being able to have a dialogue is really worth it, because by doing this, by having these conversations, you're really building a foundation for future conversations. And these are skills you can use to talk to younger generations or your family members, not just about Israel, but about a lot of other charged issues. And there's no lack of those in this world. So
Pam, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nazia, tell me more about what Israel does that troubles you. Yeah, just like leaving the conversation open. This, obviously you won't have one conversation on this and be done, right? Like that's not how complicated conversations go. But just allowing for your child or grandchild to trust that you will listen to them, and even if you disagree, will listen to them in a way that doesn't come across as confrontational, really makes you a valued person to have conversations with.
Right. I couldn't have said it better. And it really, as you were saying, it leaves the door open for, better conversations and more open, honest conversations. So this is the end of our presentation. We're happy to take any questions. We would love for you to keep in touch with us, follow us on Facebook. Maybe we'll have an Instagram one day. That'll be exciting. You can tell your family members to follow us too, and feel free to reach out to us at any time. Our emails are here, and I'm sure Pam is happy to share them after this.
Brina, we got a question today from somebody who couldn't attend but wanted to know, does IAN either have a list or is there a resource where parents who are sending their kids to college can sort of see where the more terrible anti-Israel activity takes place? Are there colleges that are better than others, worse than others? Or if their kids are already going to a college, where can they find the resources for an individual university? Because I'm just looking around this call, there are several people with kids in universities.
Yeah, so I would say feel free to have them reach out to me. I do a lot of the research for IAN. So the problem with some of these databases on college campuses is they're not necessarily well updated or given context as to like what the anti-Israel events are, really what the situation is on the ground. I would be happy to help with any parent who has a question about universities in their area. Absolutely.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
And I just Googled, my daughter's a high school senior and she's going off to school in the fall. So while you were talking, I was Googling her school just to see what comes up first. But luckily there wasn't a lot of activity. But my question is, and I tried to put it in the chat to Brina earlier, but I probably didn't word it the right way. So in Greenwich, I don't think there's that much activity, at least in my daughter's circles, where she is probably not familiar at all with BDS or SJP, and I'm not that familiar with it either. And maybe it's just my circles that I'm in, or maybe I'm like sort of trying to deal with all the other problems I have right now and
Sure.
with COVID and everything else. But
Yeah.
I guess my question is, are these kids going off to school? And PS, now they're like sort of messed up because they've missed a whole year and some of their what should be normal for them. So they're already going off to school and we have no idea how that's going to go. But are these organizations and clubs and movements, are they really obviously, to the people who don't know about them, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist? Or is my daughter, let's say, or any of her friends who feel like they're open-minded and they're humanists and all, and they're looking for new things and ways to belong, and these clubs are sort of pitching themselves as human rights and all that, like, is it obvious? Are they going to know, or are they going to sort of get in and say, oh wait, maybe I shouldn't be here? I'm just curious because I'm not familiar enough to know.
Yeah, so this is why I said to Pam that I would be happy to work on campuses in question on an individual basis, because there is a very, and Brina, please chime in, but it is very campus by campus. So there is a national structure to SJP and other anti-Israel organizations that have this. So it's the national chapter and then all of the individual chapters on each campus. And they are given a lot of leeway when it comes to how they organize and advertise themselves. So I would say more and more, they are a little bit more open about being anti-Zionist, just as part of their chapters. But they also co-sponsor, they are very good with coalition building on college campuses. And so there's a lot of co-sponsoring with a lot of other organizations on campuses that have nothing to do with the conflict, have nothing to do with Israel. And so I think in that way, it is difficult if you're coming in with very little knowledge or experience of these groups. And look, I mean, I'll say for me, I had no idea what these groups were when I went to college, and all of a sudden I was on Columbia's campus during Israel Apartheid Week, and I was like, oh wow, like there's all of a sudden this whole ecosystem of conflicting groups, and it can be very overwhelming. So I think that's really where these questions of, if your daughter has a strong sense of identity and really what matters to her, I think it becomes easier to spot groups or organizations that will conflict with that. But it can be difficult.
Yeah,
What
I
about
would just
wait, but Ellen's question brings up something that I think is out there that's very insidious. There are groups, I would think, like if not now, who use a Jewish Talmudic quote, in their title, right? So and are basically a Jewish group, and I think that even a kid who has a strong identity might drift to a group that sounds like it's that calls itself a Jewish pro-Israel group, right? And then not know. So there's some of that, right?
Sure, it's difficult. If not now, is definitely a somewhat unique group in that other groups that try to do a very similar thing, like Jewish Voice for Peace, which has campus chapters now, labels itself strictly anti-Zionist. If not now, as far as I know, doesn't actually have a statement on Zionism or a one state versus two state ideology, which makes it a difficult one. And I think this is why having these conversations earlier rather than later with your kid becomes so important, because I think you need to create an environment where it's safe to be critical of Israel without and having these difficult conversations, so that they don't feel like they have to go to an If Not Now chapter to feel heard, because I think that does happen, especially with a lot of younger people.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is that there's a very similar idea with like all of these movements, If Not Now, BDS, where there's definitely a discrepancy between what the movement itself believes or claims to believe and who the members of the movement and the leadership of the movement are. So I think for If Not Now, for example, as Paulina said, they don't take a stance on Zionism. They're not, actively or explicitly anti-Zionist or, anti-Israel or pro-BDS. Even they don't support the BDS movement. They don't even take a stance on it. The only stance they take is that they oppose what they refer to as the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. And that's it. That's their whole mission. That's their whole raison d'etre. So, but we know that there are many members of If Not Now who do support BDS, who are anti-Zionist. That doesn't mean that, they speak for the whole movement, but it is telling that, those are the people that the movement attracts. And I think also our JUF Israel professionals, Emily Brickman, Emily White, always talk about how their issue with If Not Now is often more based on strategy rather than content. So it's not really the content of what they believe that is so problematic as much as it is the way they go about, advocating for those beliefs. So for example, they've been known to do a lot of disruptive types of protests outside of like the Jewish Federation building and like other Jewish institutions, and specifically Chicago, rather than, setting up a meeting with a Federation professional and saying, hey, let's sit down, let's talk about this. They're coming and yelling and screaming and saying, like, you're terrible, you're not teaching us a nuanced enough narrative on the conflict. And it's not really something that's conducive to a conversation or to a resolution, which is what they claim, they want. They claim they want to integrate this narrative that they have into the Jewish community and come to, a solution. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Also, I think something like knowing the name of like Students for Justice in Palestine, it might be a little obvious, like what, the group stance is on Zionism. But I think on, other progressive groups, as we said, a lot of these groups are kind of co-opted by, anti-Israel activists who come in and say, okay, your movement is aimed at, freeing refugees or, combating food insecurity, whatever it is. Let's also add on to that and oppose, the Israeli the Israeli government's treatment of Palestinians, let's say. And so, yeah, your child might show up to a meeting really feeling passionate about food insecurity or, indigenous rights or whatever it is, and hear this rhetoric kind of spiraled in, which wasn't like the original intention of the club or, doesn't even necessarily reflect the club's values. So I think the more that you and your child know going into the situation, the better, you're equipped to, determine what is within the tent and what is outside of it.
Do you have time for one last question? See if anybody has any questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Even if you can't think of your question right now, we can always connect you to IAN, either to Paulina or Brina or somebody else, or they'll refer you to another place. But one thing we are committed to doing is helping you find answers to any of the questions that start brewing as the kids go to college or come home from college. So Paulina and Brina, thank you so much. And thanks for the work that the Israel Action Network does. It's really quite important, and we're very grateful to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. And don't hesitate, don't be a stranger. We're around.
Thank you guys so much. It was very informative.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good night, guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.